Why don't we start? Welcome, everybody, to Engineering Trust in Online Marketplaces. It's the second installment of our Boston Digital Business Leadership Forum series. I'm Pete Howard, Executive Director of the Digital Business Institute at the Boston University Questrom School of Business. We're a sponsor of this event, along with the Questrom IT department, and it's all part of the Inside at Questrom series as well. To get things started, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel. Steve Tadelis. Steve is Professor of Economics and Sarin Chair in Leadership and Strategy at Berkeley, Haas. His research primarily involves around e-commerce and the economics of the internet. Steve's worked at Amazon, where he applied economic research tools to a variety of product and business applications, worked with technologists, computer and machine learning scientists, and business leaders. He's also worked at eBay Research Labs, where he hired and led a team of research economists who focus on the economics of e-commerce, with particular attention to creating better matches of buyers and sellers, reducing market frictions by increasing trust and safety in eBay's marketplace, very important, understanding the underlying value of different advertising marketing strategies, and exploring the market benefits of different pricing structures. Aside from the economics of e-commerce, his main fields of interest are the economics of incentives and organizations, industrial organization, and microeconomics. Welcome, Steve. Andrei Hagiu is the Associate Professor of Information Systems at Boston University's Questrom School of Business, here with us. His research and teaching focuses on multi-sided platform businesses, e.g. Airbnb, Alibaba, Amazon, eBay, Google, Grab, PlayStation, Uber, etc., and their unique strategic challenges. He also advises and angel invests in startups attempting to build multi-sided platforms. Really have great experts here today for this topic. Our format today will be a discussion between Professors Tadelis and Hagiu, with time at the end for Q&A. Please submit all your questions through the Q&A box. So let's just get started. Professor Hagiu.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everyone. I will just be very brief because Peter introduced both of us. The only thing I would mention is like Steve and I share a passion for marketplaces, and he will talk about trust in marketplaces, which is probably and arguably one of the most important aspects of having a successful marketplace. Steve, the floor is yours, and I may interrupt you at some points to, have some fun discussion before we open it up to everyone.
That would be great. I'm going to share my screen now, with your permission. And I think it seems to be working. Is that right?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Andrei. Indeed, Andrei and I share this passion in marketplaces, and in fact, Andrei has been working in this area for quite a few years, longer than I have, despite me being his senior in more ways than one, as you can see from the color of my hair. And I'm grateful for this opportunity, as well as other interesting opportunities that Andrei has always introduced me to. So without further ado, let me jump into what I'd like to talk about here. And that is the idea of creating and fostering and increasing trust in online marketplaces. And for that, if we take a step back and think about the relatively simple idea of what reputation is as far as an economist would treat it, well, reputation, trust, these are different ways that we think of the fact that we're in a world with incomplete enforcement, right? In other words, when I buy something from someone across the globe, if they get my payment and they send me a defective or maybe not even anything in the mail, there's very little I could do in terms of enforcement, especially if it's across borders. But even within a country, these kind of transactions are not very easy to enforce in terms of the quality and expectations of the buyer. And for that, of course, trust is an important lubricant. If I don't trust that this transaction is going to be completed to my satisfaction, I'm not going to, send a payment or give my credit card number or so on. And this is a very old idea that is not new to online marketplaces like Etsy or eBay or Taobao, but in fact goes back millennia. And there's some research that has shown how in the old world, this idea of reviews or reputations was as important as it is on the online marketplaces that we see today. And I'm citing a couple of important contributions to that idea, where Abner Greif showed how in medieval times these North African Maghrebi traders very much had long distance trade all based on their personal reputations. And then if someone did mess up, other people were responsible for making someone whole so that the whole group still maintains a positive reputation. Milgram, North, and Weingast have shown a very interesting marketplace application, which are marketplaces, again, in medieval times. And these were called the trade fairs. And what these trade fairs were basically certain geographical points where once a week or once a month, depending on the kind of goods being traded, both sellers and buyers would congregate there, meet each other, exchange goods and so on, and then go off on their own way. And importantly, there were these centralized, they called them law merchants, so that if a buyer who bought something was unhappy, they could complain, and that law merchant would basically impose a reputational penalty on the seller or the seller's village, so to speak, in order to support this idea that if you don't follow up with your promise, you will be penalized by the fact that people will not want to engage with you in the future. And that's the whole idea of reputation and feedback in both in the old and the new world. So without further ado, let's look at an example of how this is implemented. I'm going to pick eBay here as my example because I've done quite a bit of work using data from eBay. As Peter mentioned, I spent a couple of years at eBay almost a decade ago now. And in that capacity, the team that I hired and worked with, we both did research that had external exposure, but we also did a lot of internal facing work. And the best work was when these two really merged together quite nicely. And this is some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about today. So eBay was really the pioneer of marketplaces, which you may be surprised to know that because especially any of you who are under the age of, say, 30, have missed the glory days of eBay. In the late 90s and early 2000s, eBay was really one of the darlings of the internet. And like I said, they really were the first wide-scale marketplace, but they didn't invest in really promoting this technology in a way that they expanded their footprint, and instead other companies came in with that same business model. If it's Airbnb or Uber or Etsy, these are all variations of the eBay model. And if you look at the way that trust is created, then it really is going to be here in this little box when you click on a certain good. So here I search for a Apple MacBook. I had a whole list of things. I clicked on one of the items, and here you see the item. I could buy it now for a little under $1,300. And here is who is selling it. Electronics Valley is the name of the seller. And let me blow up this box because this is where the reputation and feedback information is initially. You see the name of the seller, and you see two numbers here. You see 21,814, and you see 99.2% positive. Now, what these two numbers mean is the following. On one hand, the people who bought from the seller, some of them chose to leave feedback. The feedback could be positive, neutral, or negative. What the big number here, 21,814, describes is the number of positive reviews minus the number of negative reviews, right? Think of it as net positives, so to speak. And similarly, what we have here in 99.2% is the number of positives divided by the number of positives plus the number of negatives. Neutrals are ignored here. And because of that, we have the number, say 99.2%, means that of those positive and negative feedbacks, 99.2% were positive. Now, I don't know about most of you, but when I look at a success rate of 99.2%, for me, that sounds like an extremely high number, right? And that would lead me to have a lot of confidence in whatever is going on here. But if I would show you the distribution of feedback on eBay, and this is a snapshot from 2013, I think, is when we pulled this data, then what you see here in red is unweighted by dollar amount sold by sellers. What you see here in blue is weighted by dollar amount. So if we just focus on the red for a second, here's what this tells us. The median is 100% positive, okay? As you can see, in fact, a little over 60%, closer to 65% of sellers have a perfect 100% score. The average is 99.3. So if I go back to, Electronics Valley, 99.2%, that's below average and starts sounding a lot like the Lake Wobegon effect for those who remember the old radio series, Prairie Home Companion. And the 10th percentile, right? This is the seller who is at the 10th percentile from the bottom of this feedback ladder, so to speak, is 97.8%. Now, of course, when you look at these numbers, there are two possible reactions. One could be, wait a minute, this is exactly why the reputation system works. If you fall below some very high number, people stop buying from you, you close your shop, you disappear, and that's why the numbers are so high. And of course, there's another view, which is this is really all about grade inflation. People are just leaving very positive feedback, even when they're not as happy with the outcome. Now, if that's true, that means that we have some problems in terms of understanding how to get some signal from this very noisy data, which is feedback data. And as a platform, as a marketplace, how can we match buyers with better sellers? And here is the broader problem described in a little comic from a few years back, understanding online star ratings. A lot of places use stars instead of out of 100%. 5 stars has only 1 review, 4.5 is excellent, 4 is okay, and everything else is crap. And indeed, more and more research that popped up over the last few years seems to suggest that grade inflation is a big problem in these online marketplaces. You see some work that was done, that first paper by Apostolos, Horton, and Golden used data from a website at the time called Odesk and Elance that merged. Now they're known as Upwork, and they showed how grade inflation really is contaminating the value of the signal of these feedbacks. And there's another paper by some of your own, including Georgia Zerbas from the marketing department at BU, a first look at online reputations on Airbnb, where every stay is above average. Again, that Lake Wobegon effect that I mentioned earlier. So if we think of the challenges that this implies, then, well, there's the grade inflation problem, which seems to be ubiquitous across platforms. There's also another problem with relying on feedback that economists really would point at, and that's the public goods problem. And here's what we mean by that. Well, if I buy something on eBay, or for that matter, on any other site, and I have a good or bad experience, then I'm expected to spend time and energy, namely logging in, getting to the page, and leaving feedback, which takes time and effort on my part. And I'm not getting anything in return because I have already consummated my trade. So according to pure standard economic theory, where everyone is selfish, in that world, no one would leave feedback. fortunately, there's this whole area of behavioral economics where people do all sorts of things that are quote unquote irrational. One of them is leaving feedback. And a common explanation is that people feel some connection to the rest of society, either through altruism or through other regarding preferences. And that's why they care about their fellow, humans that may trade in the future, and they want to prevent them from going through a bad experience or help steer them towards a good seller, which is why people leave feedback. And interestingly, and we'll kind of put that to rest, historically, at the very early days of eBay, more than 80% of transactions had feedback left. When I left eBay in 2015, then we were around 60, close to 60% of people leaving feedback. I doubt that changed much. Maybe it dropped a little bit more, but still, even if only half the people would leave feedback truthfully, that's a lot of data. So let's put that aside for a second. Another problem that we have with these online review systems is what we call the cold start problem. So if you think about it, let's say that Peter starts a new marketplace and Andrei joins as an early seller and he starts selling and people buy from him and he's giving great quality and therefore he gets great reviews and now his reviews are stacking up and he's charging a nice price. And I'm looking at that and I'm saying, wow, I could sell that same stuff and even at a cheaper price and turn a nice profit. Let me enter Peter's marketplace and try to compete with Andrei. And I list this pen that he's selling for $1.20 and I'm listing it for $1.15 or $1.10 and waiting for all those orders to come in. And surprise, surprise, no one's buying from me. Now, why is that? Well, because Andrei has a reputation score of 5,000 and a percent positive of 99.5, and I have nothing. And if you as a buyer approach this marketplace and you say, well, it's true, that's 5-10 cents cheaper, but I don't know anything about this guy. And Andrei, look at his feedback. I'm going to focus on that and I'll pay that small premium. And therefore we could think of established reputation of being a barrier to entry for a new seller who wants to sell, or for that matter, for a new product that's trying to compete with other similar products. So that's another problem that marketplaces face. And finally, we have the issue of fraud, which could be very simple fraud, which is sellers don't deliver. But here I'm thinking more about reputational fraud, where sellers are in cahoots with buyers, or they themselves create fake buying accounts, buy from themselves, and then manipulate their own reputation, or maybe buy something from a competitor and give them a negative feedback in order to negatively impact theirs. So that's another thing that marketplaces need to worry about. And these are all problems that are based on social science, if you will, transactions, trade, economics, reputation, but they have to be implemented in engineering terms, right? Because a marketplace is being built here, algorithms are being put into place in order to support that. And really the question is, what insights could we get from the idea of reputation economics together with the engineering in order to create a better marketplace? So here I'm going to quote a friend and colleague who Andrei also knows well, Al Roth. Al Roth is a very well-known economist. He's at Stanford, and I think Andrei and Al overlapped for quite a while at Harvard Business School before Al moved to Stanford and later Andrei moved to BU. And here's what he was quoted almost 20 years ago. This was not in reference to online marketplaces that much, but more broadly to markets in different ways. And where he said, market designers cannot work only with the simple conceptual models used for the, oops, I see I'm blocking my own slides here, used for theoretical insights into the general working of markets. Instead, market design calls for an engineering approach. And what does he mean by that? It means in economics, what we like to do is write little models that are caricatures of the world to help us understand the world. And sometimes we'll use those models in a pure theoretical sense in order to analyze a situation and understand it better without data. Both Andrei did a lot and very important work on understanding marketplaces using those tools. And then you also have the application of these models to data, what kind of analyses to do, and then how to design an optimal outcome. Well, a lot of times optimal outcomes are just going to be too obscure. And what I believe Al really intended is as an engineering approach where we tweak things by some trial and error with a broad understanding of what's the right direction, but we'll never know what's optimal because there are too many moving parts. There's too much data in too many different directions where there's noisy signals, and we're going to need to kind of do something that looks pretty good, even though it may not be the optimal solution in a theoretical perspective. And what I'm going to do is cover a few vignettes along these lines. I'm doing a very quick time check here. Okay, so here is the first vignette that I want to quickly cover. I told you that the feedback and showed you that the feedback that eBay presents is extremely skewed and seems very biased. So we could ask ourselves, where is that bias coming from? And it turns out that that bias seems to be coming from silence. What do I mean by silence? It means I went ahead, I bought this pen on eBay, and it arrived and it's cracked. And it's really not what I was hoping to get. It kind of works, but it's, you know, if I knew this was cracked, I would not pay $1.20. But here's the thing. Do I want to leave negative feedback and then have the seller send me an email? Why are you doing this to me? You know, this is my livelihood. And it's just such a hassle. Or God forbid, the seller may even threaten me. And we actually found some interesting newspaper clips where sellers did threaten or even sue buyers for leaving them negative feedback. Then you might just say, you know what, I did not have a great experience. It's not worth it for me to deal with this hassle of having all this backlash from leaving negative feedback. I'm just going to silently leave eBay and not buy again, or just, you know, think of eBay as not a great place for me without expressing that opinion. Whereas if I had a positive feedback, oh, I'm perfectly happy leaving a positive feedback and saying, you know, great transaction, because there are no follow-up negative ramifications for me. And the implication of that would be that silence includes both lazy people who had good experiences or bad experiences and were not willing to leave feedback, but it also includes people who, if they had a positive experience, they would leave feedback, and if they had a negative experience, they wouldn't. Now, of course, this is all still in the world of conjecture, right? Notice what I'm doing now. I'm telling you a story, a narrative, a theory of how the world works. Some people always leave feedback. A lot of people will only leave feedback if it's good, and if it's bad, they won't. And then a whole bunch of people don't leave feedback at all. And because of that, silence includes some negativity. Now, what would that imply? Look at this example here. I'm going to create a new measure that I'm going to call effective percent positive. And this is going to be the number of positive feedback divided by the total number of transactions. So I'm including positive, negative, neutral transactions, but importantly, I'm also including silence. Now, what would that mean in terms of percent positive that eBay presents, that I showed you the 99.2, and effective percent positive that I'm now inventing? Well, imagine these two sellers, A and B, that for the eBay data, the way the eBay presents the data, they would look identical. Why is that? Both of these sellers have 99 positive transaction feedbacks and 1 negative transaction feedback. So their percent positive is 99 divided by 100, or 99%. And their rating is 99 minus 1. Remember, it's the positive minus the negative, which is 98. That's how it would appear on the eBay site. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to calculate the EPP for these two sellers, which means that for seller A, I'm not going to divide 99 by 100, but I'm going to divide 99 by 120, because there are 120 total transactions, 20 of which were silent. And for seller B, I'm going to divide 99 by 150 because this seller had 50 transactions of silence. And of course, this means that the EPP of the first seller A is going to be higher than seller B, in this case, 82.5 and 66. Now, if my theory is correct and silence includes negativity, then A is a higher quality seller because A is causing less silence, and silence has a bad component in it. So I still have to prove that this is indeed a measure of quality. Now, how do I know that this is capturing that? But first, let me see if this signal in and of itself looks any more interesting than the original percent positive that looked like a hockey stick because most people had 100%. And indeed, the effective percent positive distribution looks very different. It looks like a distribution. It has a mean and median of about 65%, and it had a standard deviation of about 13–14%. So the signal to noise, if this is indeed a measure of reputation, is quite nice. But now the question is, does it really measure seller quality? And for this, we use what economists call a revealed preference approach. So what do I mean by that? We are going to look at the behavior of customers, of users on eBay, after they transact with sellers with different EPP scores. If my theory is correct, then the buyers who engage with the high EPP sellers, let's say 95%, they should be happier than those buyers who engage with the low EPP sellers, let's just say 5% for that matter. And if indeed they are less happy, it means that the less happy people should be less likely to come back to eBay, right? So their future behavior of purchases on eBay is going to validate the hypothesis here, that theory, that this is going to be a good measure of quality. And indeed, that's what we did using this idea behind our head. Imagine you're a buyer, then the common sense, and in economics, we translate common words with fancy words, and economists will call this the buyer's Bayesian dynamic decision problem, because I am buying something from eBay, and then I'm asking myself, after I bought once, do I leave eBay or do I buy again? Do I leave eBay after the second or do I buy again? And this tree could be infinitely long. And what's the prediction of common sense or Bayes updating? Well, I'm going to have a certain expectation coming in. If I had a good enough transaction relative to that expectation, I'm going to buy again because I had a good experience. And if I didn't, I may choose to leave. So behavior of people will basically be a distribution of how many people leave after 1, after 2, after 3, after 10 transactions. And we could do that at the seller level, right? How many, for a given seller, are people leaving after they transact with her or him, or are they continuing? And we could look whether that is impacted by the effective percent positive. So let me speed up a bit and show you what we have here. So here's what we did conceptually, just so you get an idea, and this is where working with very big data is fantastic. We looked at a cohort of new users who joined eBay, the US site of eBay, anytime in 2011, and we took a 10% random sample of them, okay? Importantly, they had to purchase an item within 30 days of setting up their first online account. So we took almost 1 million buyers, because there were about 10 million people almost that signed up in 2011 and completed that purchase. Then we looked at all their purchase behavior all the way until May 31, 2014. So on average, this gave us about 3 years of potential transactions for every buyer. And that gave us a total of a little over 15 million transactions. Then we just took everything that was in the eBay database, because we had access to eBay's. We didn't have to scrape data. That was the benefit of working inside the company. And for that, we included all the information we had on the item sold, right? What category, the title, who the seller was, so on and so forth. There were a total of close to 2 million sellers, a little over 1.8 million sellers associated with these 15+ million transactions. And of course, for every seller, we have their past history, their percent positive, and we calculated the EPP, the effective percent positive, this new metric for each and every seller at each and every transaction. And then we took this data and applied it to that revealed preference approach, which means what? It means that we're now looking at the average effect of having a certain effective percent positive on the likelihood that a buyer who transacts with that seller is going to come back to eBay and transact again in the future, right? And because buyers do not even know the effective percent positive, we're not worried about what we call sample selection problems and biases in these regressions for those who are familiar with that terminology, or as economists call it, the endogeneity problem, lurking variables, because nobody knows the effective percent positive, no one could select on it. We're the only ones who could include it in our analysis. So therefore the regression really has this kind of idea of like exit, voice, and loyalty. That's a famous book by an economist at Princeton, where people vote with their feet or with their voice. And here, people will vote with their feet if they leave eBay. People vote with their voice if they leave feedback at some point. Here, I'm going straight to some of the results that I want to show you. And what we've done here, we've created 4 categories of EPP, effective percent positive. Think of the bottom 25th percentile, really crappy if our measure is a good measure. The second quartile, 25 to 50% of that distribution. The third and the fourth, which is the highest. And here we see this is the highest, this is the second highest, this is the third. And these numbers are all relative to not having, to being in that worse bucket of EPP. And the same seller is the idea of how does the EPP affect the likelihood that a buyer will return to the same seller? And eBay is how does EPP affect the likelihood that a buyer returns to any seller on eBay? Now, we see 2 things here. First of all, the numbers on the right are higher than the numbers on the left, meaning that the impact, the negative impact of transacting with someone that doesn't have a great EPP is hurting eBay more than it hurts the seller itself, which of course makes sense because people are thinking of eBay as a marketplace, and therefore the reputation that I'm thinking about when I transact on eBay is part seller, part platform. Second, you see that the numbers increase as we go down, 0.5%, 2%, 2%. These are about the same for the same seller. For eBay, we have about 2%, close to 3%, and 4%. And these are all statistically significantly different from each other. And what this means is, compared to the worst EPP, if I would have transacted with the next bucket of that second quartile, I would be 2% more likely to return to eBay. And compared to that bottom quartile of EPP, if I interacted with a seller from the third quartile, I'm almost 3% more likely, and that highest quartile would make me 4% more likely to return to eBay. And this kind of confirms what we conjectured, that this EPP measure is a good measure of quality. Now, very quickly, what did we do in terms of implementing this into the site? Well, this is what a search page looks like on eBay. And if you would type MacBook Air, you get this list. eBay decides what ranking to put here. And until we did this project, the EPP was never something that eBay looked at, so this was not part of the ranking. And we convinced them to run a controlled experiment where this is an A/B test in the jargon of tech, where some people would get a match, an algorithm that shows them a ranking that includes the EPP. So the sellers that would be ranked higher would be those that have a higher EPP at the margin. It wouldn't completely disrupt the order, but would kind of tilt it more towards that reputational effect. And what you see here is by tilting it, we didn't lose much relevance. And this is what I mean by that engineering approach, because the algorithm they used to rank things was based off of a machine learning algorithm that maximized conversion. They wanted people just to buy. They didn't worry about people staying on in the long run. Now, if it's optimized for conversion, it means that if we tweak it a little bit, we shouldn't be affecting conversion that much, but we may indeed benefit the long run return. And here we see that we didn't change conversion much. And we've also seen that those buyers that were exposed to the new ranking were more likely to come back to eBay, which completely confirmed these results. So here you see a way in which we take some very simple economic theory, apply it to people's behavior, come up with a conjecture, validate it, and then engineer a solution that changes the ranking. It turns out that there are other directions we could go with this engineering approach. And here we were motivated by another fact in the eBay data. So here you see a snapshot of all the transactions on the US site of eBay in October 2011. There were a total of a little over 44 million transactions, which is quite a lot. And again, you see that there's almost no negative feedback, about 0.4%. Surprisingly, disputes filed, which is contacting customer service, which is a bigger hassle than leaving feedback, is almost 3 times as much in terms of that negativity. So it shows, yeah, people are not that keen to leave negative feedback. But then we took advantage of the fact that eBay allows buyers and sellers to communicate. And here what we did is we saw that after the transaction was over, almost 9% of transactions had an email sent by the buyer to the seller. And of them, almost a little more than a third of those emails had language that had some negative content in it. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a non-negative message. We were actually surprised that some people even leave non-negative messages, right? Hello, good morning. I'm glad to tell you the 2 items arrived safely. I'm very happy. I needed them for a dinner party. Thanks a lot. Kind regards. Here is what we call a negative feedback. I purchased 2 pairs of shorts at the same time, one this, which I have received, one ebony, which I haven't received. The haven't received, that means something negative happened. The beauty of the advances in data science is the advent of machine learning and natural language processing, where we could use statistical tools to analyze textual data, which we applied here. And what we did is we basically divided the messages, the transactions, into transactions with no messages ahead of time, after the transaction, with messages that we called neutral because we couldn't find any negative language in them, and then those with messages that were negative. You could see that a vast majority, about 90%, a little less than 90%, had no messages. Remember, that was a little more than 90%. There was 8.6% that had messages. Of those, about a little more than a third had negativity in them. And here on the y-axis, you see customer satisfaction, which is an agglomeration of different metrics within the eBay database that customers did not have a problem. And you see that about 96 to 97% of folks were happy, those who didn't leave messages. Of those who left messages that we couldn't identify as good messages, as negative messages, still we have a big jump in how unhappy people are, a little more than 10%. But those transactions that were associated with a negative message, more than 30% were bad transactions. And here what we did is we ranked sellers according to the percent of those messages that they generate that were negative. And as you see here, the more negativity in generation, and this is just in estimation, what you see here in the gray is the confidence interval, which is how confident we are with that estimate. And once you go above 50%, there's not enough sellers there who have generated that much negativity. So we have, more noisy signals. But that monotonic and strong relationship is very clear up until around 60, 70%, where the worse you are in terms of email generation, the worse you are in terms of causing people to be unhappy. And we verified that those unhappy people were less likely to come back to eBay. So this gave us another engineering metric of how much negativity is a seller creating through messages to put into that ranking algorithm. I very quickly want to mention two alternative ways of, I would say complementary ways of adding more signal to noise here. One is some work that I've done, and this is also with eBay data. It's more recent with a few academic colleagues. And this explores the idea of what we call certification or badging in the industry. So here you see a search page from eBay, and here you see a little badge, and this badge says top rated seller. Airbnb has a badge called Superhost, if any of you noticed it. Upwork has, I think they call it Trusted Freelancer. That's a website for freelancing. And here you see, here's a seller that has it, here's one that doesn't, here's a third that has it. And this is in a way the platform doing the following. It's saying, hey folks, this is a seller that we give a special badge to, meaning you should trust these sellers more than the others because we've established that they've done good, okay? Now, this is on one hand, a very nice mechanism because it like takes away the thinking from the buyer, right? It says, you know, here are trusted people. If you're concerned about trust, just buy from them, you'll be fine. At the same time, it's very coarse. And the question is, what is it going to do when you introduce it? And what would happen if you play with that bar? What if you make it harder to get a certificate or make it easier to get a certificate? This is the kind of questions we explore here. And it turns out that these are a lot trickier than the previous stuff where we actually found a clean, interesting few measures of seller quality, and we could implement those into rankings and just, you know, demote bad sellers and promote good sellers. Here, this badging has broader equilibrium effects, and a simple way to think about it is the following. Imagine you have some, you know, ladder of quality from the highest, the best, all the way to the lowest. And I'm putting a badge that basically says you're above a certain quality. Now, if I make that badge more stringent, right? I put the bar higher, I make it harder to become a qualified seller. Notice that I've done two things. I've increased the quality, the average quality of sellers with badges, because I've thrown away that bottom part that previously was badged. But now those people who no longer have badges, they were all much better than the people who didn't have badges before I made the change. So now the average quality of unbadged people is also going up. Now that may sound great. Everybody's quality goes up, but of course that's impossible. I'm just moving that badge, that threshold. Well, it changes the incentives of different quality sellers to enter the marketplace. And very simply to think about it, you know, who really benefits? Really great sellers who could keep a more valuable badge, and kind of the shittiest sellers who are now bunched together with better people. It's the people who are around that badge boundary who no longer obtain a badge, or for whom it's much harder to obtain a badge, for whom entering the marketplace becomes less attractive because they don't have that coveted badge anymore. And what that means, it's going to change the distribution of quality. And the marketplace has to better understand what kind of distribution the buyers are looking for in order to determine that optimal strategy. So here, economic theory is helpful at telling us that we're going to have interesting and non-trivial changes in the distribution of quality. And the last vignette that I want to mention here is work that I've done with a couple of colleagues in China using data from Taobao. And this is a completely different approach. Rather than the platform trying to find engineering ways to separate good from bad sellers, here the idea is actually to let the reputation system, those simple feedbacks, work even better than they would otherwise. And the idea here is that they actually allow sellers to pay for feedback. In this example that we have here, this is based off of a product experiment, basically, that Taobao did about 8 years ago, that we were able to later obtain the data. they never actually fully implemented it, even though our analysis after the fact suggested it was a very good idea, where they let, like I said, sellers offer buyers discounts or coupons or cashbacks for leaving them feedback after a transaction. Of course, you might worry, it's like, wait a minute, now you're letting the cat guard the milk, so to speak. Well, it turns out that Taobao did it in a very clever and interesting way. They told the sellers that they could put away a pot of money to pay buyers for feedback, but Taobao will be the judge that decides which buyers will get the payment for the feedback. And it's not going to be based on whether it's positive or negative, but on whether it's informative. Whether, again, using machine learning, natural language processing, this seems to give information about the product. So if you buy a pair of jeans and all you write is, oh, I bought this product, it was awesome, and that's all you wrote, that's a completely generic feedback, and Taobao would not reward you. But if you wrote something like, I bought these jeans, they fit great, I love the look, it's clear that you're talking about fashion and jeans, that would be an informative feedback. And if you similarly wrote, I bought these jeans, they're not as described, the sewing around the seams is defective, and you're leaving negative feedback, you will still get paid by Taobao because you clearly are leaving informative feedback. And what we showed here is that that mechanism really killed two birds with one stone. On one hand, it helped separate the good from the bad sellers. And the intuition here comes from another theory in economics called signaling theory. If I'm a good seller, I'm happy to participate in this program if I want to, gain feedback, because I trust the fact that I'm doing a great job, you're paid to leave me feedback, you're probably going to tell the truth, and therefore I'm going to get good feedback. Versus if I'm a bad seller, you're paid to leave me feedback, I'm going to risk getting negative feedback, I shouldn't pay for feedback. So that separates the good from the bad. The second thing it does, it helps solve the cold start problem that I mentioned earlier, because now if I'm a seller with no reputation, I could buy my way through that early phase of no one wanting to buy from me. And now, after I've established myself, because of that signaling effect that I mentioned earlier, I will now be able to take off. So to very quickly conclude here, marketplaces can engineer trust to solve these missing market problems that we call the asymmetric information, the fact that people don't know exactly how good a seller is when they buy from her or him. And using a market for feedback could also help sellers promote themselves, is another way that we see this working. And one thing that is interesting is, remember that in the early stuff that I use, that effective percent positive or the emails, it's important that sellers can't manipulate those, because if they could, that would take away the value of those signals. So it's also important for these marketplaces sometimes to not be transparent about how they're ranking people so that people won't be able to game it. And also we're using machine learning and natural language processing could be a critical input into doing this correctly. And for those of you who may go off there to found your own businesses along these lines, it's really important to understand the consumer journey and derive what we call testable hypotheses, like what we did with EPP. Here's a testable hypothesis. We could go to the data with that hypothesis, confirm whether we indeed seem to show an understanding of what's going on, and then finally, apply those lessons to design a better marketplace. And with that, I am done. Andrei, how are we doing on time?
Awesome. We have only 10 minutes. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this rapid fire. So this is like fascinating stuff. And I'm sure like you and I can talk about it for hours. I do want to, so there's at least a couple questions from the audience. Okay. And this is where I actually want to encourage the audience. If you have other questions, please type them in Q&A. So this is fascinating. I wish, by the way, given I spend a lot of time with startups, I think this should be mandatory reading or listening for every like marketplace startup to think a little bit more in a more sophisticated manner about this. So one thing that I want to point out, which I'm sure you already know, what strikes me is when you look at marketplace startups, how like relative to what you explained, which is, basically how you should think about, designing these mechanisms, how truly unsophisticated they are. They all basically copy the, I asked them like, why are you doing 5 stars? I don't know, because everyone else is doing 5 stars. No one is thinking about these effects. They all end up with like 4.9. There's no, there's no thought about like, at least like, so if the question here that I have for you, if you had to say like, what are the 2 or 3 most basic things that you should implement when you start off as a marketplace? Let's not get like, there's a lot of more sophisticated stuff that large marketplaces that you describe can do, but you just starting tomorrow, like a marketplace, what are the most basic design things that you think should be there?
Okay, that's a great question. And, let's start with one that I know, feeds into a lot of the work you did, Andrei. Marketplaces have at least 2 sides, right? Most of them have 2 sides. And one of the things that a lot of marketplaces fail to understand is that it's not who pays them that tells you who's more important. Both sides are critical.
Right.
So eBay, for example, one of eBay's biggest mistakes early on that they never quite overcame, it's still a successful company, but you look at eBay's growth over the last 25 years and you look at Amazon and you see 2 very different stories. One of the things that early on eBay mistook for was the way eBay made money is by sellers paying them a fee for the sale and buyers didn't pay them anything. And therefore they thought sellers are our customers and buyers make it work, right? So let's make sure our sellers are happy. Now, of course, if buyers are not happy, then there's not going to be a lot of interaction. Understanding that both sides are equally important, that chicken and egg problem, how do you get it rolling, is critical first and foremost. So when you're thinking about where does the trust friction come in a marketplace where you have clear buyers and sellers, the trust is primarily one directional, right? So you really need to kind of, build on that versus maybe Airbnb where the trust is 2-dimensional, right? Because if I go into your apartment, I could trash it, I could leave it dirty. The buyer can do very little once, we establish payment schemes where the payment is up front. In the very first year of eBay, people send checks in the mail, so buyers could also be abusive by getting the good and not paying. Right. But that's one very important thing that I think a lot of marketplace founders don't quite understand the power of both sides.
So one-sided versus 2-sided. The other one, again, let's do this very quickly before I ask the other questions. The one that strikes me as very important is like they don't know how to think about like, okay, should I have 3 stars, 5 stars, how many stars, and then what should you show, right, to buyers? Because this idea, I think it's very naive. Like, I'm just going to show the average score. Like, I think it's ridiculous, right? It's based on what you said. Like, it could be inflated. Like a 4.8 means something very different on Uber than on Airbnb. Like, you have to give some notion of the distribution.
Yeah.
What is the most basic thing you would recommend there?
I think the verdict is still out here because, I was listening to the last week's Freakonomics Radio, the podcast, and there was a very interesting exchange. This is about advertising effectiveness. So another topic that is near and dear to my heart. And when Steve Dubner asked Steve Level, but businesses are spending all this money on advertising, doesn't that suggest that it works? And his response, well, in economic theory, yes, businesses do things that are good for them. But anyone who spent time working in a business knows that decisions are made by people and people don't maximize profits. And I'm certain, Andrei, you've seen this time and again with the startups that you advise. I think the verdict is still very much out on the optimal way to display information to buyers in online context. One of the big problems, like you said, is that people just copycat what they already see. And people are scared about experimenting with new ways. So for example, maybe the simplest thing to do for a marketplace is have 3 categories. Green, we see no problems with these sellers. Yellow, there were some complaints about this seller in the past, or this, or maybe new, right? Some flashing blue new seller. And then once a seller is established to be bad enough, just kick them off the site. take away the burden from people is what I think is the right direction to go, which goes against economic theory, because in economic theory, everybody understands exactly what 4.83 means. And this is where, after being at eBay, you've heard me say this, I'm sure, my favorite saying became, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is.
That's brilliant. Yeah, no, I totally agree with this advice. So it has to be try as simple as possible, and then basically like work our way up from there. All right, so let me take a couple questions that I think are very interesting. So Rahul's asking, do you see the potential in decentralized marketplaces that use the blockchain-based reputation mechanism, smart contracts to achieve trust? So I think this is a very fundamental question. Like as we look forward, what does that do to marketplaces?
Right. Yes, that's a great question, Rahul. I think the answer is yes. I definitely see this potential where there's this talk that it's been going on for years about some kind of, meta reputation. I have my Airbnb score, I have my eBay score, I have my Amazon score, of a third party, a centralized place where, that could feed into, and I could have a meta score. That's where blockchain technology would really be useful to keeping track so people can't manipulate that. So I definitely think that that's a direction that we may see progress in the next few years.
So actually what I would add to this is like a big topic of discussion for like investors and marketplaces, like what does that do to the defensibility of these marketplaces? Because basically you can say like, well, trust is actually, the fact that they have these reputation mechanisms, it's a bit part of their competitive advantage.
Right.
And now that we have these meta, like if you can have a meta trust system where like the seller basically, I have my trust that's independent of Airbnb, dependent of eBay, does that commoditize marketplaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I think the issue is, how much will the fact that you already have the thickness in and of itself be a bit of a barrier, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's enough. I don't think so. A lot of blockchain enthusiasts tend to say like, this is the basically we're going to have it's the end of Uber and Airbnb just because everyone has a reputation and identity that's outside, and of course that's not the whole story, right? You still need.
And the thing to remember there is, every time you walk into a CVS or Walgreens and go for some ibuprofen, right next to the $4 generic, you're going to have the $8 branded that people are still buying. So Uber and Lyft are not, well, at least one of them is not going to go away anytime soon.
Right. Have you done any work? So this is from Bob Solomon. Have you done any work in B2B marketplaces where transaction sizes are larger, so the risk is higher, but there's more data on the counterparty? So that's an interesting twist on reputation.
I have been on an advisory role for a startup here in the Bay Area called Roofstock. And they're a marketplace for real estate investing. So the smallest transactions there on the order of $150,000, $100,000. A lot of the big players there are business players that basically own portfolios of homes, and they re-optimize. So you could argue that there's more risk. At the same time, the assets are very well defined, and once the transaction takes place, there's title. So there's a little less risk on the asset side. So it's a little hard for me to say whether the risk is higher or not. There on the counterparty, things are a little less important if you have the right information on the good. Otherwise, I could see how the frictions could be a bit higher. So, it's a very tentative answer to your question, Bob, but yeah.
I think basically the point there is you can also rely a little bit on the outside, the legal system and other things to supplement for things that you would normally do if it's completely anonymous peer-to-peer, like you would actually have to do yourself. So in some, I guess it could go both ways. The risk is higher, but there's also external mechanisms that alleviate the trust issue a little bit.
Absolutely.
Last one. So great talking. You have mentioned that the matching algorithm should be opaque in order to prevent gaming behavior. However, one could argue that transparency is key to trust. Any thoughts on this?
Yes. So this is something I've thought about quite a bit, and I still believe that opaqueness is indeed necessary, because the trust here, right, is about me, a buyer, trusting that the people I engage in the platform are sellers who are not going to screw me over. The platform may need to, use certain algorithms and approaches that I don't fully understand. And here's, for example, a fact, when you go to your physician, unless you're a physician yourself, and the physician says, look, this is the medication you need, and you'll get a second opinion maybe, and you're like, okay, I don't understand why, but I'm taking this. And here you're relying on, well, I hope they're doing the right thing, and I see that people get better, so I trust it. The same thing here. I don't know how eBay manages to do that ranking. What's important is whenever I select one of the sellers that appear first, I've never had a problem. So that's the sense in which I think the opaqueness doesn't take away the trust, because it's the outcomes that are going to reinforce that trusting behavior.
And you also want to prevent, like we said, you need to prevent gaming.
And you want to prevent the gaming, exactly. And that's something that
important.
is all about, yes. Mm-hmm.
All right, so again, we can go on further, but I think we'll be mindful of time. So Peter, let me turn it back to you for final words or whatever our final mandate is here.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you both, Steve, Andrei. That was absolutely fantastic. As an e-commerce person myself, love this topic and love to hear more about it. To your point, we could go on for a while. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining. Thank you for participating. Really appreciate it. And with that, we'll just wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much again, Steve. Thanks very much for doing this. That was great.
Thank you for inviting me. My pleasure.